a street closure that isn't on any map, a police escort required just to reach certain addresses, 3 shootings in 1 week, all within 4 blocks of each other, a pizza delivery driver who simply won't cross a specific street after dark and hasn't for years, a mail carrier's route quietly reassigned, no public explanation given. You think you know Pennsylvania. Small town Friday nights, front porches, neighbors who still wave from across the street. That's the postcard, and for a lot of the state, it's still true. But in certain towns, on certain blocks, that postcard stopped being accurate a long time ago, replaced by something residents live with quietly, because talking about it out loud tends to invite exactly the kind of attention nobody wants. Don't take a shortcut through unfamiliar blocks in these towns. Don't assume your GPS knows which streets to avoid, because it doesn't. And don't assume this is exaggerated for effect, because the town at number 1 on this list has a section so contested that the county itself has publicly acknowledged it no longer has full operational control. Number 13. Faro. Faro sounds like an old iron mining name, and it is. A town built in the 1880s around a small but productive ore operation that fed the region's broader steel industry for the better part of a century. It was, for most of its history, an unremarkable, stable, small town of around 6,000 people. The mine closed in 1979. Faro didn't collapse overnight the way some single industry towns do. Its economy diversified just enough to survive, limping along on a mix of small manufacturing and retail through the 1980s and 90s. What changed Faro wasn't the original industrial loss. It was what moved into the vacuum left behind roughly 15 years ago, as a documented regional trafficking network began using the town's cheap, largely vacant housing stock as a staging point. By 2019, the borough's own police department was reporting a violent crime rate nearly 4 times the statewide average for a town its size, concentrated almost entirely within a 6-block radius around what used to be Faro's original commercial district. Residents in that radius have adjusted their routines accordingly. Porch lights left on all night, certain streets avoided reflexively after dark, deliveries redirected to a single better-lit intersection rather than door to door. The Borough Council has debated, repeatedly, whether to request additional state police support beyond its own 6-officer department. So far, funding has never quite lined up. Faro keeps waiting. Number 12. Kessler Heights. Kessler Heights was built as exactly what its name suggests, a modest planned residential development laid out in the 1960s on a hillside overlooking a larger neighboring city, marketed at the time as an affordable, quiet alternative to city living. For its first 2 decades, that's more or less what it delivered. Economic pressure on the neighboring city through the 1990s pushed both population and eventually organized criminal activity outward into surrounding communities like Kessler Heights, where housing was cheap, oversight was thin, and the local police department, sized for a much smaller problem, was quickly overwhelmed. By the mid-2000s, a documented territorial conflict between 2 competing groups had settled into the neighborhood, centered specifically around control of a stretch of the development's main connecting road. That road has been the site of at least 9 confirmed shooting incidents since 2015, according to county records, several during daylight hours. Residents living along it have, in a detail that stuck with the community's reputation regionally, taken to parking their own vehicles at odd angles specifically, to create informal barriers, a workaround born entirely of necessity rather than any city planning intervention. The Heights portion of town, the original 1960s development, is now functionally split from the rest of the borough in the minds of most residents elsewhere, a distinction nobody officially drew but everybody understands. Number 11. Belhaven. Belhaven's name promises exactly the kind of place it once was, a small riverside town built around a modest manufacturing base, with a main street that into the 1980s still supported a genuinely active local economy. The manufacturing left gradually through the 90s, the way it did in dozens of similar towns across the state, and Belhaven settled into a long, slow decline that, for a while, looked like every other struggling small town on this list. What changed for Belhaven specifically was its river access. The same waterway that once moved manufactured goods out of town proved over the past decade equally useful for moving other things in, and by 2020, county investigators had documented Belhaven as a minor but persistent node in a regional trafficking corridor. Its riverside warehouse district, mostly vacant since the manufacturing exodus, repurposed for storage nobody official ever authorized. The warehouse district itself, 4 blocks along the riverbank, has become a place local residents simply don't go, day or night. County sheriff's deputies conducting a coordinated raid there in 2021 recovered enough evidence to result in 11 arrests, though residents will tell you, if you catch them in a candid moment, that the activity resumed within months. You'd expect a river town to feel open, breathable. Belhaven's riverside feels like the opposite, closed off, watched, quiet in a way that has nothing to do with peace. Number 10. Sable Ridge. Sable Ridge grew up around a quarry operation in the early 1900s, a modest but steady employer that anchored the town through most of the 20th century before finally scaling down operations in the 1980s and closing outright in 1997. Like a lot of single-industry towns, Sable Ridge's population contracted steadily after that, from a peak of nearly 500 down to just under 2,600 by the most recent census. The specific dynamic that's made Sable Ridge dangerous isn't trafficking or a territorial conflict in the way some other towns on this list have experienced. It's a documented, escalating pattern of retaliatory violence between a small number of extended families with roots going back generations in the town. Disputes that residents describe as having genuinely lost track of their original cause somewhere along the way, sustained now more by momentum than by any specific grievance anyone can clearly articulate. County court records show a marked increase in aggravated assault and weapons charges tied to this dynamic since 2017. Concentrated overwhelmingly on a handful of streets near the old quarry access road. Local police, working with a department that hasn't grown in staffing since the 1980s despite the escalation, have described the situation candidly in public borough meetings as one they're managing rather than resolving. Sable Ridge's main street, several blocks removed from the affected area, still functions more or less normally. It's a genuinely strange split, a town that's simultaneously fine and not fine, depending entirely on which 4 streets you're standing on. Number 9. Halstead Crossing. Halstead Crossing sits at the intersection of 2 state routes, a location that made it a natural stopping point for travelers for most of its history. Motels, diners, gas stations, a modest economy built entirely around people passing through rather than staying. That economy held up reasonably well into the 1990s, when a new interstate bypass routed traffic around the town entirely. Cutting off the foot and vehicle traffic Halstead Crossing had depended on for decades. The empty motels that resulted, 6 of them within town limits, all built for a volume of travelers that never came back, became, over the following 2 decades, a documented draw for exactly the kind of low-visibility criminal activity that empty, disconnected buildings tend to attract. County records show repeated raids across multiple motel properties since 2012. And at least 2 of the original 6 structures were eventually condemned specifically due to conditions discovered during those investigations. Residents describe a town that's functionally divided by the old highway strip, the motel corridor, largely avoided, and the older residential core a half-mile away, which has held on to something closer to normal small-town life. The corridor itself, though, has developed a reputation regionally that's outlasted several rounds of individual arrests and property seizures. Shut one operation down, residents will tell you, and another finds the same convenient empty building within months. Number 8. Pruitt's Landing. Pruitt's Landing was, for most of its history, a quiet river-adjacent town built around small-scale fishing and, later, light industry. Nothing dramatic, nothing that made headlines, just a steady, modest economy that supported a population that peaked around 3,200 in the 1970s. The decline here was gradual and largely unremarkable until roughly a decade ago, when a documented shift occurred. A criminal organization operating primarily out of a larger city 40 miles away began using Pruitt's Landing specifically for its proximity to a regional highway interchange, treating the town less as a destination and more as a convenient node in a larger supply route. That distinction matters, residents will tell you. Pruitt's Landing isn't where the real activity happens, but it's absorbed real consequences regardless, caught in the transit rather than the destination. Since 2018, county records show a sharp rise in vehicle-related violent incidents specifically clustered around the interchange access road, carjackings, at least one documented ambush-style shooting connected to a disputed shipment in 2020, and a persistent police presence that residents describe as more visible than it's ever been in the town's history, without actually making the underlying problem go away. The old fishing docks, largely unused for their original purpose for decades now, sit within sight of the interchange, a quiet, almost peaceful backdrop to a stretch of road that residents have simply learned to treat as somewhere else entirely. Number 7. Grimsby. Grimsby earned its slightly unfortunate name, honestly, from a founding family rather than anything more ominous, and for most of the 20th century, it was a genuinely unremarkable coal town, rising and falling with the industry the way so many others on this list did, its mine finally closing in 1974. What sets Grimsby apart is a specific incident that reshaped the town's trajectory more suddenly than the mine's closure ever did. In 2016, a multi-agency investigation into a regional drug distribution network culminated in a raid that resulted in 34 arrests connected to Grimsby addresses, a genuinely enormous number for a town whose entire population at the time sat just under 1,900. The raid made regional news for a news cycle and then, as these stories tend to, largely disappeared from public attention. What didn't disappear was the vacuum it left. County records show that within 18 months of the 2016 raid, a new, less centralized pattern of activity had emerged in Grimsby. Harder for law enforcement to target precisely because it lacked the single organizational structure the original raid had been built to dismantle. Shootings connected to this fragmented activity have occurred at a steady, low-level pace ever since, not the dramatic spike of 2016, but a persistent baseline that residents describe as, in some ways, harder to live with than a single crisis would be. Grimsby's Main Street business district, 3 blocks removed from the areas most affected, has actually seen modest reinvestment in recent years. New signage, a handful of small businesses opening. It's the kind of quiet, contradictory detail that makes Grimsby hard to categorize simply as declining. Parts of it, genuinely, are trying. Number 6. Larkspur. Larkspur, despite its gentle flower-derived name, was built as a straightforwardly industrial town. A textile mill anchoring its economy from the 1890s through the mill's closure in 1988. A closure that, like so many others on this list, triggered a slow, multi-decade population decline from a peak of roughly 5,000 down to just under 2,400 today. The specific dynamic in Larkspur that's earned it a place on this list is territorial rather than organizational. Two loosely affiliated groups, both largely composed of extended family and longtime neighborhood networks rather than any formal criminal hierarchy, contesting control over a roughly 8-block stretch of the town's original mill worker housing district. County prosecutors, in charging documents from a 2019 case connected to the conflict, described the dispute's origins as tracing back at least 15 years, predating most of the individuals currently involved in it. The contested district itself has seen documented gunfire incidents occur with enough regularity that the borough's volunteer fire department has developed informal protocols for coordinating response timing with police in that specific area. A level of operational adjustment that speaks to how routine the danger has become. Residents living just outside the 8-block zone describe an almost surreal contrast. Normal small-town life on one side of an invisible line, and a persistent low-grade conflict on the other, separated by nothing more than which street you happen to live on. Number 5. Cutbank. Cutbank takes its name from the steep river embankment that runs along one edge of town, a geographic feature that, for most of its history, was simply a scenic backdrop to a modest agricultural and light manufacturing economy. That economy held up reasonably well into the early 2000s, later than many towns on this list, before a series of manufacturing closures between 2003 and 2011 accelerated a decline that's continued steadily since. What's made Cutbank specifically dangerous is a documented pattern connected to the very embankment that gives the town its name. The steep, wooded riverbank terrain has proven, according to county law enforcement statements made at a 2021 public meeting, exceptionally difficult to monitor or patrol, and has become a preferred site for exactly the kind of activity that benefits from being hard to observe. Multiple firearms recoveries and at least one fatal shooting in 2020 have been directly connected to the embankment area. Residents living in the streets closest to the embankment describe a specific, low-grade anxiety that's less about any single dramatic incident and more about the accumulated, unpredictable presence of activity they can hear. Vehicles, voices, occasional gunfire, without ever being able to see clearly what's happening below the tree line. It's a particular kind of unease, living adjacent to a danger you can hear but not see. And Cutbank residents have lived with it for the better part of a decade now. Number 4. Whitlock. Whitlock, at its peak in the 1950s, was a genuinely prosperous town, built around a diversified manufacturing base that gave it more economic resilience than most single-industry towns on this list. Resilience that meant its decline, when it eventually came through the 1980s and 90s, was slower and less dramatic than many of its neighbors. That slower decline is part of what makes Whitlock's current situation notable. Rather than a single triggering event, county investigators describe a gradual, roughly decade-long escalation beginning around 2013 as a series of smaller local disputes between rival groups consolidated into a more sustained conflict, driven in part, according to a 2022 grand jury report, by competition over a shrinking pool of economic opportunity in a town with fewer legitimate options than it once offered. The result has been a documented rise in violent incidents concentrated in Whitlock's original downtown core. Ironically, the same blocks that once represented the town's greatest prosperity now represent its greatest risk. Storefronts that once housed thriving small businesses sit either vacant or, in a handful of cases, occupied by operations that longtime residents describe carefully, and law enforcement describes with rather less ambiguity in court filings. The contrast between Whitlock's handsome, well-preserved early 20th century architecture and its current reputation is, residents will tell you, one of the more disorienting aspects of living there now. Number 3. Draymore. Draymore was built around rail freight operations in the early 1900s, a modestly prosperous transit town whose fortunes tracked closely with the broader rail industry's decline through the second half of the 20th century, its last major freight operation scaling down significantly by 1985. What distinguishes Draymore is the specific role its remaining rail infrastructure, largely idle since the 1980s but never fully decommissioned, has come to play in recent years. County and state investigators have documented Draymore's rail yard as a transit point in a broader regional network, its low visibility and minimal ongoing security making it, in the words of one state police statement from 2020, an unfortunately convenient gap in regional enforcement coverage. The yard itself, technically still owned by a rail holding company with no meaningful local presence, sits largely unpatrolled, its perimeter fencing breached in numerous places and never fully repaired. Residents in the streets immediately adjacent describe regular nighttime vehicle and foot traffic through the yard that has nothing to do with any legitimate rail operation, and a persistent, low-level unease that's become simply part of living in that section of town. A 2021 Joint Task Force operation resulted in several arrests and a temporary lull in activity. Residents describe the lull as exactly that, temporary. Number 2. Coral Heights. Coral Heights developed later than most towns on this list, a mid-20th century residential expansion built in the 1950s to house workers from several nearby manufacturing operations, none of which were located directly within Coral Heights itself, meaning the town never had a true anchor industry, and its economy was always somewhat dependent on conditions elsewhere. When those nearby operations began closing through the 1980s and 90s, Coral Heights lost its economic purpose without ever having controlled it directly, a particularly difficult version of the industrial decline story that's played out across this list. What followed over the subsequent decades was a documented gradual takeover of significant sections of the town's housing stock by an organized group operating what county prosecutors described, in a major 2019 racketeering indictment, as a systematic property-based criminal operation, acquiring vacant and tax-delinquent homes throughout Coral Heights specifically to use as operational bases, effectively controlling entire blocks through a combination of intimidation and outright property acquisition. That 2019 indictment resulted in over 40 arrests and was, for a period, treated as a resolution to Coral Heights' problems. County crime data since suggests otherwise. Violent incidents in the affected sections of town declined only modestly following the arrests, and residents describe a situation that shifted rather than resolved, with new individuals occupying roles vacated by those arrested. The borough's police chief, in a candid 2023 public statement, acknowledged that certain streets in Coral Heights remain, in his words, not fully under municipal control in any practical sense, a striking admission from an official source, and one of the more direct acknowledgments of the situation described anywhere on this list. Number 1. Merrow Junction. Everything on this list has followed some version of a familiar pattern. An industry leaves, an economy struggles, and into that vacuum, organized criminal activity finds room to take hold. Merrow Junction followed that pattern too, in its early stages. What makes Merrow Junction different And what's earned it the top spot on this list is the scale and persistence of what's happened there since, and the fact that county and state authorities have, in a manner almost unheard of elsewhere on this list, publicly acknowledged the depth of the problem rather than managing it quietly. Merrow Junction was built around a rail interchange in the late 1800s, much like several other towns on this list. Its economy anchored for decades by the freight traffic that passed through it. That traffic declined steadily through the mid-20th century as rail consolidation rerouted freight elsewhere. And by the 1980s, Merrow Junction had settled into the kind of slow, unremarkable decline common to dozens of similar towns. Population falling gradually from a peak of nearly 7,000 down toward its current figure of just under 3,100. What changed Merrow Junction's trajectory more dramatically than most towns on this list was a specific confluence of factors documented extensively in a 2022 state police report. The town's rail interchange, though no longer commercially active, retained direct highway access that made it exceptionally well positioned for use as a regional distribution hub. Its housing stock, nearly 40% vacant by the early 2010s, provided ample low-cost operational space, and its police department, funded for a town roughly twice its current population, was structurally unable to scale enforcement to match the activity that moved in. By 2015, according to that same state police report, Merrow Junction had become host to operations connected to at least 3 distinct organized groups, contesting territory across the town in a pattern of escalating violence that peaked between 2017 and 2020, a period during which county records document 23 shooting incidents, 4 of them fatal, concentrated overwhelmingly within a roughly 12-block area surrounding the old rail interchange. Residents living within that area describe adjustments to daily life that go well beyond anything else documented on this list. Children walked to bus stops by adults in organized groups rather than individually. A local church that shifted its evening services earlier specifically to avoid nighttime travel for its elderly congregation, and a volunteer neighborhood watch network that, according to interviews conducted for the state police report, ultimately disbanded after 2 of its members received direct threats. In 2021, in a decision that made regional headlines at the time and that county officials still reference directly in public meetings, the county formally requested sustained state police support for the affected 12-block area, not a temporary task force, but an ongoing presence, an arrangement county officials described plainly as necessary because the borough's own department and the borough's own authority had become insufficient to manage what was happening within its own limits. That state presence remains in place today, 4 years later, a level of ongoing external law enforcement involvement that stands alone on this list. And that speaks, more clearly than any statistic could, to how completely the situation in Merrow Junction outgrew the town's own capacity to handle it. Drive the old highway that skirts the 12-block zone today, and you'll see a state police vehicle stationed at the interchange more often than not. A visible, permanent acknowledgement of a problem nobody, at any level, has managed to fully solve. Residents who've stayed, and many have, this remains, after all, still somebody's hometown, describe a particular kind of resilience that's hard to fully convey from the outside. A community that has adapted to living alongside an ongoing crisis rather than being able to resolve or escape it, going about daily life within blocks of a conflict that state authorities themselves have effectively acknowledged they can only contain, not end. If your GPS ever tries to route you through Merrow Junction's old interchange district, take the long way around. The people who live there would tell you the same thing. From the quiet, contested streets of a town like Faro to the 12-block zone in Merrow Junction that state police have now patrolled for years, These are communities facing a version of crisis that goes beyond simple economic decline, real, ongoing conflict playing out on residential streets, absorbed quietly by residents who, in most cases, have nowhere else to go and no easy way to make it stop. If this video gave you something to think about, do 3 things for us right now. First, subscribe. We work hard to bring you content that is researched, honest, and important. And channels like this one only keep going with the support of people who want to keep seeing towns like these covered honestly. Second, drop a comment and tell us, have you ever driven through a town like this without realizing what you were driving through? We read every comment, and we want to hear what you've seen. Third, share this with someone who'd find it useful. Someone planning a road trip, someone considering a move, or just someone who should know which streets are worth a second look before they ever end up on one by accident. We'll see you in the next one.